Hello everyone, this is Brett Thompson again. It's Tuesday, so you know what that means. It's another Teaching Tuesday. We had a request come in to talk about the difference between an assumption transaction and a subject to transaction. So normally in real estate contracts, the seller has agreed to convey the property free and clear of all liens and encumbrances. That would include, in Virginia we have deeds of trust, commonly known as mortgages. Could be judgment liens, IRS liens, any kind of encumbrances on the property. So the difference between an assumption transaction and a subject to transaction. So in an assumption transaction, the buyer is going to formally assume the responsibilities of the mortgage, if you will, in place on the property. So let's say you have a property that's worth $500,000 and then there's a $300,000 mortgage on the property. Well, in part of the negotiations, the buyer in an assumption transaction could say, hey, I'll work with your lender and I will step in your shoes as the borrower, and I will become the new borrower. So the lender is involved, they have to consent to it, and there is some documentation that'll be executed and also recorded in the land records, which will formally replace the named borrower from the seller into the name of the buyer. And so therefore, if there's any kind of default under the loan, if the buyer, after they close, if they fail to make the mortgage payments, then the lender's recourse is against that buyer and not the seller. So the seller gets to walk away with no further exposure to liability, as opposed to a subject to transaction. So a subject to transaction is simply saying that the buyer is purchasing the property subject to the existing lien or liens, and they are not making any representations or warranties in regards to liability in place for that loan. Contractually, they can promise to make the mortgage payments. So contractually, the buyer can say, hey, I promise that I'm going to pick up the mortgage payments, okay, and then I'll make the mortgage payments post-closing. However, the risk on a subject to transaction is heavily on the seller side. So the problems are the seller has now at closing transferred title to the property. The lender's not involved, they haven't consented to it. All right. So if the buyer down the road fails to make a mortgage payment or is late on the mortgage payments, that's going to actually negatively impact the seller's credit score, because that loan is still in the seller's name. Also, if the buyer were to just walk away subsequently and just throw their hands up, walk away, and there was a foreclosure, the foreclosure would show up on the seller's credit because that loan was never transferred or paid off. Another thing that you want to be aware of is in most 30-year federally insured loans and mortgage documents, there is what we call an acceleration clause in the deed of trust, also known as a due on sale clause. So if the lender does not consent to this subject to transaction and they're not involved in it, once you transfer your ownership interest to the seller at closing, that would immediately trip the acceleration clause. And the acceleration clause essentially says, hey, borrower, if you convey any interest in our collateral, which is the house, if you convey that out, if you convey your ownership interest to a third party, we can call the note, meaning that they can accelerate the loan, and whatever the balance due, they can say is now due and payable immediately. And they would call the note on the seller, okay, because the seller is the named borrower. So those are some risks involved in a subject to transaction. So an assumption transaction is evenly balanced in regards to risk, all right? So because the lender's involved, and once the title to the property is conveyed, the seller is no longer on the hook for the loan, as opposed to a subject to, the seller is selling the property, the loan isn't being paid off, the lender isn't involved, and I guess the seller is just going to cross his or her fingers and hope that the buyer fulfills the buyer's promises to make the mortgage payments in a timely fashion. So hopefully that kind of give you a little clarity in regards to the difference between an assumption transaction and a subject to transaction. We'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks a lot.